Hey everyone, this is Dr. Drizzle and welcome to the National Parks Expedition Challenge. Today we're on the banks of the Mississippi River in St. Louis, Missouri. We are at the Gateway Arch National Park. We're actually going to visit the arch, we're going to go into the old courthouse, we're going to talk about the history, the architecture, and the engineering. Join us. All right kids, so right now we are in the visitor center of the Gateway Arch National Park. And we're going to find out a little bit about why we're here and why this national park is here. So Chris, thank you so much for having us today. We are excited. A bunch of kids are watching and they're going to be interested to know about the park and the history behind it. But I want to know your history. How did you get here? What's your background?
Well, I came into the National Park Service naturally. My father also worked for the National Park Service, so the National Park Service has been part of my life as long as I can remember. And he worked early on at historical parks, Antietam National Battlefield, Cumberland Gap National Historic Park, and that's where I got an interest in history. So as far back as I can remember, I've always been interested in history. And I went to college to study history, and when I got out of college I was thinking, I have a history degree, where can I take that? And I thought the Park Service, the place where my dad had been his whole career, was the place to go.
So you were a park brat?
Pretty much, yeah. We traveled around Virginia, Wyoming, Maryland, West Virginia, so we lived a lot of different places, moved around a lot of my life.
So we've talked to other rangers at different parks, and they talk about their experience of moving around themselves as a park ranger. But you told me you've been here for 25 years?
Yeah, that's right. And that is unusual for people who have a career in the Park Service. It does involve a lot of moving around. But yeah, I actually started out here with an organization that runs the gift shop, and I started out taking tickets at the theater. And so, started out small, and when I got an opportunity to move into the Park Service, I took that opportunity, and here I am now.
So what about this place kept you here this long?
The thing about the arch is it's so famous, it's so spectacular, it brings people from all over the country, all over the world, and that's an exciting thing for me. It's kind of like when when you're a kid and you're in show and tell and you have something you really want to show people. I really want to show people the arch because it's such a great thing for people to see, and people want to see it. And I like being sort of the gatekeeper, the person who welcomes people to this national park site.
Well, let's take a little walk and see what else we can find.
That sounds great.
Chris, I know that people that are watching today are really interested to know why and how this arch was built. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, the arch is a monument to mark the place where the West began, and it commemorates St. Louis's role as the gateway to the West. So in the 19th century, after the Louisiana Purchase by Thomas Jefferson, people started to cross the Mississippi River, and there was a town here that they could come to make their final preparations and get supplies and meet with other folks who are also going out west on the Oregon Trail, Santa Fe Trail, going out to California in the gold rush, going up into the mountains to trap furs. So all these different people were coming here to this spot as they got ready, spread out across the West to settle the country. So in the early part of the 20th century, people in St. Louis looked back at this period, they looked at the riverfront area, and they felt there should be something here to remind everybody about this period and how important it was to America. So the National Park Service got involved after Franklin Roosevelt declared this to be a national park site. Then they held a contest in 1947 to decide what the monument was going to look like. The winner was a man named Eero Saarinen, who was a Finnish-American architect. He went on to other famous structures like Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C. But this was his first major project, and he chose a simple shape, an arch that would rise above the riverfront and symbolize a gateway. Now the arch is made up of 142 steel triangles, and the triangles are stacked on top of each other. Each of the three sides of the triangles are made up of two steel skins. The outer skin is stainless steel and the inner skin is carbon steel, and there's concrete between the two skins up to 300 feet. So they would stack these triangles on top of each other. When they got to a point where cranes weren't high enough to lift up the sections, they actually bolted tracks on the outside of the legs of the arch as they were building it. They attached what they called creeper derricks onto the tracks. The creeper derricks would move up the tracks with cranes on them. They could lift up the sections and continue building the arch till they could put the final piece in.
I survived. I have claustrophobia.
You did a great job.
Coming up in that little small tram, which is really small, was a little scary. But you told us some great interesting facts about the whole tram and how it was made. Can you share those now with us?
Well, yeah, Erin, who designed the arch, wanted people to be able to come to the top. So they put out a bid to different elevator companies to come up with a system that would bring people up. And of course, they needed there to be a certain amount of people needed to come up in an hour to make sure they could serve as many people as possible. And most of the other companies weren't interested in designing anything. They couldn't figure out a way to do it. A man named Dick Bowser, who worked with his father building elevators for parking garages, took up the challenge. They told him he had 2 weeks to present a concept for how to do it. And as you said, what he came up with was sort of a combination of an elevator and a Ferris wheel. You had to negotiate the curvature of the arch. So as we were riding up in that round car, the car moved a little bit, rotated a little bit, just to keep us level as we went up the curve. And so we actually, from the time we left the bottom of the arch until we got up here, we actually turned about 180 degrees.
But we went slow enough that I didn't realize that we were making that turn. Had you told me that on the bottom, I would have been a little bit more scared.
Yeah, it's not like an amusement park ride. Some people think it is, but it moves very slowly, and it's something that most people can take.
So now we're at the top of the arch, and obviously he wanted to have, like you said, a place for people to be able to look out. Now, I'm not feeling any movement, but on a windy day, can this arch sway a little bit?
Yeah, it is. It does sway sometimes. It takes about a 15-mile-per-hour wind before we'll really start to feel anything. That's probably about a half an inch, and people will feel it at that point. They did tests before they built the arch with models and with a wind tunnel, and they figured out that in 150-mile-an-hour wind, which is pretty significant, it would sway about 18 inches. And that seems like a lot. 18 inches, you wouldn't feel like you would want to move that much in the wind, but you think of other buildings, and like the Empire State Building in New York, they move factors of feet in the wind. So 18 inches is remarkably small when you think about it.
And it's really important for these types of buildings to have that opportunity to sway. We have to have some way for the energy to be absorbed. So this is a good thing.
It needs to give. If it's too rigid, it's just going to crack. So you need to have that little give.
This has been a wonderful morning here at the Gateway Arch National Park. A little bit later, we're going to head over to the courthouse and learn more about the history and some historic cases that have been won or lost there. But Chris, I know some of the kids are interested in becoming a park ranger. We ask at the end of every video, how can you become a park ranger? So tell us quickly your journey one more time about your college and what you studied and how they can become a park ranger.
Well, you want to get that background in whatever subject that you're really interested in. Of course, with me, it was history. With the national parks, you could be interested in almost anything and find a job in the Park Service that goes along with it. So do those studies, get that educational background, but at the same time, you want to get opportunities to work with people, because that's really the main thing that we're doing here. So when you are old enough, when you get an opportunity, start volunteering in places like you could go to historic sites, historic homes, conservation sites, science museums. Start volunteering. When you get a summer job, look for those places. But as I said, the most important thing is to be able to work with people, to be able to kind of meet people from where they're coming, because people come from all over. They have different backgrounds. They see things in different ways, and you have to be open to that. And with the Park Service, you really have to believe in the mission of the Park Service, which is to connect people to these wonderful places. And that's what the Park Service is all about. That's something you really have to believe in.
All right. Chris, thank you so much. It's been a joy to be here. So we have now crossed over to the old courthouse, which is part of the Gateway Arch National Park. And we're here with Tony. He's going to tell us a little bit about the history and also talk about a court case that you may be familiar with. So Tony, take it away.
Okay, well, my name's Tony Gilpin. I'm a park ranger here. And I got into the Park Service kind of accidentally. I was in between jobs and I ended up working seasonally here. And I moved into a full-time job eventually. So I've been here almost 30 years, actually.
Oh, wow.
So it's been a really great job. In essence, I'm paid to read history books and talk to people, which I find I like doing both of those things. So a little bit about this building. This is easily the most important historical building in the state of Missouri. This building is where much of what we think of as the American West took place early on as the country expanded into the western frontier. And it's a beautiful structure for its time. You can see from our model here that it didn't always look like this. It was 23 years under construction. It was finished in 1862 during the Civil War. It cost what was then an astonishing amount of money, roughly $1,200,000. Now our model here lights up and shows you the different phases of construction, but you may be able to see here in the east wing, where the early building sat by itself. And that lasted 10 years and was considered the finest building in the state of Missouri at that time. And then they added a small rotunda, a west wing, and these extensions to the north and south wings. And then they tore the original building down in the 1850s and they extended the current wing we have now in the east. And then they added the north and south wings along the way, taking off the old wooden dome and establishing the big cast and wrought iron dome. So all of that took 23 years, again at a cost of $1,200,000, again an astonishing amount of money. This was never the state capital of Missouri, it was the county courthouse of St. Louis County. It's interesting that the city and county are again trying to reunite. It could be a statewide ballot issue actually coming up soon. But in 1876, the city of St. Louis kicked the county of St. Louis out in effect. And so this became the city's courthouse in 1876, when they used it up until 1930, and then it was considered just too old and out of date, not big enough. So they went down the street to a modern skyscraper, and then for the next 10 years, this building was abandoned. The Park Service acquired it in 1940, and we have been restoring it ever since. So that's a quick history of our old courthouse. But again, the who's who of the West walked the hallways here. Men like Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, William Sherman, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Hart Benton, Henry Clay, John Fremont, to name a few. The first two Dred Scott trials took place here, which we'll talk more about here in a few minutes. And also, this is where the city came for many of the public events. The Rotunda is a fabulous structure. It would hold about 2,500 to 3,000 people. And any famous person coming to St. Louis, a big political event, anything being discussed that the city was interested in would be happening down here at the Rotunda. So it was sort of the forum for the entire city and county and for much of what was happening in the American West. So wagon trains formed around the building all day long as they were going into the West. The Missouri Supreme Court met here at one point for about 20 years, and this was the major tourist attraction in the city. So your first stop off the steamboat, like you see behind me in this picture, excuse me. So you would arrive in St. Louis in a steamboat like this, maybe a wagon train. Your first stop would be here to the Rotunda to meet your parties, to see what was happening in the city, and really just to look at it because it was the tourist attraction in the city.
Well, you are definitely reading those history books very well. A lot of history here.
Thanks. It is. This is, again, the most important historical building in the state of Missouri.
So Tony, we know that one of the most famous court cases that our kids study, the Dred Scott, was actually fought here. So tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, I will. The Dred Scott case is considered one of the worst decisions by the United States Supreme Court in the nation's history, but the first two trials started right here in this building, one of its claims to fame. I should point out this photograph behind us, this is the way the building looked at that time in 1847 and 1850 when the Scott's cases began in this building. He was born in Virginia, probably around 1800. He was brought by his owners to St. Louis. They were known as the Blows. And in 1833, they sold him to a surgeon in the U.S. Army, who then went to Illinois and Wisconsin He brought Dred Scott with him, so Dred lived in free territory, Illinois, the state of Illinois, and the territory of Wisconsin, all together for about 7 years. His owner got out of the Army, came back to St. Louis, where he later passed away while traveling up in the Iowa Territory. So his property went to his widow, Mrs. Irene Emerson, and Dred Scott then sued Mrs. Emerson for his freedom. And this was quite routine. There were some 200 other cases just like it in this city alone. Slaves routinely sued to get their freedom. Scott's case was different because it did go to the Supreme Court, and the ruling that came out of it further exacerbated the United States on the eve of its Civil War. So it's not the case that started the Civil War, but it's the case that really helped ignite the U.S. Civil War. And at the first trial right here in 1847, Scott lost on a technicality. He couldn't prove that Mrs. Emerson had ever owned him up in Illinois or Wisconsin. So this was discovered evidence. He was given the second trial, also right here in 1850, and this time he wins. He would be free, but Mrs. Emerson appeals the decision. So it goes to the Missouri Supreme Court in 1852, where they reversed the decision in a 2-to-1 vote, and really to protect slavery in the state of Missouri. And this was the last time the Missouri Supreme Court would hear a slave appeal, actually. And then it would have ended right there. But in the meantime, Mrs. Emerson has gotten remarried. She now leaves to live with her new husband, Calvin Chafee, in Massachusetts. And her brother, Sanford, took over all the property. And so Dred Scott technically had a new owner. And since Scott was in Missouri suing a man who lived in New York technically, that crossed state boundaries, it becomes a federal case. And this is 1854. Once again in the courtroom, Dred Scott lost the case. They agreed with the earlier decision of 1852, and he thus appeals it to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it would arrive there in 1857. But in the meantime, back in 1854, is the juggernaut year in American history, and the year of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, Kansas, on the western edge of Missouri, should have been automatically free territory by previous ruling, but now it could potentially be slave territory. And so based on what the voting would go, popular sovereignty, and it ignited a civil war in Kansas that we know as Bleeding Kansas. So that went on for some time. At the same time, this case is reaching the Missouri Supreme Court. In the meantime, you had the political violence in Kansas going on, politicians assaulting each other in D.C. over the issue, and a really close election in 1856. The first time the Republican Party, which had been created because of the problems in Kansas, there is the first time they had a candidate try for the presidency. He was narrowly defeated. And so they both sides sort of hunkered down and really got into their positions. And this is the backdrop of the Dred Scott decision. So finally, when it reaches 1857, Supreme Court, they say it's a 7-2 ruling against Dred Scott. He is a slave, not a citizen. He has no right to sue. He thus loses.
Here's your challenge, and it's a little different this time. Today, we've talked about the gateway to the West. We've learned more about the Dred Scott decision. In your neighborhood, in your community, we know that things have happened that have made a difference. I'm going to ask you to write a short story or a poem about something that has happened in your community that has made a difference or could make a difference. You're going to give this to your teacher, and then you're going to post it on social media with the hashtag of NatParkChallenge. Don't forget to tag me at Daisha92. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been cold, but it's been wonderful. See you next time on the National Park Expedition Challenge. Dr. Drizzle, out.